Hey everyone. Looks like we're going to be making another video. This is going to be on American Government Chapter 3, American Federalism. I actually just did your introduction video. It is August 31st, so I'm just trying to crank these out and make them quick as possible. So again, make sure you're looking at the homeworks I posted that someone hopefully would have done a homework assignment for this for week 3. Highlights, I think, again, you would have done your first homework assignment talking about the Federalist Papers, and then your second homework assignment talking about the founding documents. Things, that I find interesting about those documents is, it's evident in the Constitution, this kind of division of power. Hopefully you guys just skim through these things. The amendments are there to, protect us from particular types of rights. And so, you'll notice in the amendments, especially the first 10, there's very much a preoccupation with, soldiers in people's houses. So, though you don't have to know the history of the United States, it's very helpful if you do. And so, obviously, we were a revolutionary country. We were founded on those grounds, and so we were very much concerned with, this kind of coercive power of Great Britain and building this system, which is going to be talked about, in this chapter, about building mechanisms with which to protect the individual person and their property, right, from not only, the tyranny of the mob or the tyranny of the majority, but from the government itself as well. So this is why, again, especially if you're a newer citizen, why Americans are, concerned about guns or having their guns, because that's how, you literally are able to check the government. And other countries have different views on this, but that's probably why the Second Amendment's not going to go anywhere. Maybe we can make modifications if you're very much against guns. Obviously, if you're for guns, you're like, Danny, what the hell are you talking about? They'll take my gun from my cold, dead hand. Relax. Just trying to talk about all the sides. So crickets decided to get loud in my house. Hopefully I'll run through this and you can't hear that cricket. I can. It's driving me nuts. But let's just kind of start with Chapter 3 then. So again, this chapter is very much focused on federalism, and what's really important to take away from this is that it's a type of government which has two parts, and this creates an inherent check and balance, right? So we have state governments, as we talked about before. When the country was founded, it was the United States. They were essentially their own countries, and so the states lost some of that power in the Constitution, but they still do have a lot of power. You're seeing this with our coronavirus response. Different states have different policies, even within the state, and that's a symptom of federalism. So, again, if you don't like the president, that's fine, but it's not just his fault, right? It's the nature of our actual system. You kind of have to. One of the great things about this class, and when you learn how things work, you kind of learn about how much politicians on all sides are really kind of trying to manipulate us, right? So you have divided into two levels, the state and central, and we call that central level the federal government, which is why it's partially called federalism. So all this, Chapter 2, as we talked about, has a lot of information that's going to come back again. But this Chapter 2, federalism is going to be referenced a lot. So you really want to make sure you have a grasp on that or asking questions in class. The second kind of thing is that there creates specific mechanisms for each level, again, to check and balance each other, right? So there are certain responsibilities the federal government has, like the military, but there's other responsibilities that states have, like, say, maintaining the infrastructure of that state is the responsibility of the state government, and then we have our California government component. So Harry, tell me, have a good definition, good key term, maybe, if you have presented this homework. Federalism is an institutional arrangement that creates two relatively autonomous levels of government, each possessing the capacity to act directly on behalf of the people with authority granted to it by the national constitution, right? So like the last one, I can't go through all this stuff quickly, but there are 5 basic characteristics of federalism, which I will run through very quickly in this video. But hopefully you've read this and you're already aware of it, right? So we have these 5 features that will be on our test. We should know it. The first one basically being that there's 2 levels, a national and a subnational level. Right, so we know that. We have the government in Washington, D.C., and then we have the government here in California and Sacramento, and every state has their own government, right? The second one is going to be that there's a written national constitution. Again, we have that. Nicolas Cage tried to steal it. It's in Washington, D.C. You can go and actually see it. It's an actual written down paper, and it has essentially the legal framework of this country, so you know what it is, so that the governments can't go, oh, no, that's not your right. It's like, no, I know it's my right. It's written, actually, in terms of a prop, it's written right here. I know my rights. The third element is that the federal system formally allocates legislative, judicial, and executive authority to both levels. And so we're going to learn that both levels of both levels of government have those three branches of government. They have a legislator, they have an executive, and they have a judiciary branch. What else do we have here? The federal system, number 4. Sorry. The national courts resolve disputes between levels and departments of government. So again, if you don't know, like California and the Trump administration sue each other all the time. Those go through federal court, and then they eventually work their way up to the Supreme Court. If there's a dispute between states, so especially in California, especially out there in Palm Desert, water rights are a big issue, and we share borders with, say, Arizona and Nevada, and a lot of our water from California comes from the Colorado River, and so that river is actually the border of several states. And so, who gets the water if it's kind of Nevada's and kind of Arizona's, right? It's the national government, the national courts that are going to solve those issues. And then the fifth factor is that the subnational governments are always represented in the upper house of the national government. And again, we know that's the case. So the Senate represents the state of California. There's 2 senators at the federal level, whereas in the Congress or the House Representatives, right? It's going to be the local area. So we have 2 national senators right now. It's Dianne Feinstein and Kamala Harris, who's the vice presidential candidate. And then you have for you guys, if you live in the Palm Desert area, if you're not commuting, I live in Ontario. It's Raul Ruiz is a doctor. He's a Democrat. He's the congressperson for that area, and he represents just that area. So the interest that he's representing isn't all of the state. It's just the Palm Desert. I think Beaumont. It's a huge actual congressional district in terms of land because it goes by people, right? So again, that's these kind of 5 features that hopefully make sense, and you want to make sure that you know. So we have here the Constitution grants Congress specific powers to ensure the authority over national foreign affairs. And remember, a lot of the things that have changed in this kind of federalism that we have is in response to the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So you're going to, again, want to know why those failed. But again, like to tax, to borrow money, to make money is all a responsibility of Congress. To regulate interstate commerce and to protect private property rights is all part of the federal government's responsibility. Again, I have key terms here, which I will not all run through, but there's these different kinds of powers that get exemplified in a federal state that these terms come up again and again. Enumerated basically means, again, it's written down, you know it's there. We have these clauses in the Constitution that you should know about, the elastic clause, or it's also called the necessary and proper clause, the commerce clause, concurrent powers. Basically means that both the state and the federal level have that power. So for instance, taxation. You get tax from the state. Maybe if you guys are working, you'll see you have tax taken from the state and then tax taken from the federal government, right? And then you have implied powers, okay? So you got to look in the book, write these down, make notes for yourself. You want to know what these things are. I really suggest compiling a set of notes because the test is basically open book, open note. But if you have it in this kind of succinct fashion, you'll do much better on your exam. Right? These open-ended constitutional powers, referring to implied powers, have allowed the national government to expand its authority beyond what is laid out in the Constitution. Right? The framers thought non-specified powers remain with the states, and the Anti-Federalists wanted the idea to be codified into law so that abuse of power could not occur in the future. So that's why we have that legacy of the Bill of Rights in these amendments, because the Anti-Federalists really didn't trust this kind of central governing power, which again is actually still weaker than many other countries. The English system, the central government's far more powerful than ours is, even though our executive is more powerful than theirs. It's even I don't know all the ins and outs of all the politics of everywhere. Again, I'm trying to keep these videos somewhat short. The Constitution lays out restrictions at the federal state level. Be sure you review things. So again, this key term here that's in the blue, the Supremacy Clause, you really want to know what that is. It basically says at the end of the day, the Constitution is the highest law of the land. It's supreme over, say, state laws. And we still argue about this in different issues come up. The 16th Amendment allowed Congress to impose an income tax. That kind of sucks. Federal grants allow the national government to transfer money to state and local governments. The federal government uses money through grants to manipulate the political outcomes in subnational governments. So I think I'm going to post my sovereign citizen video for you guys to watch probably during week 1, maybe week 2, we'll see. I'm going to post this video during week 1. But what's interesting is that it used to be the case in Montana, I don't think it is anymore, that they didn't have a speed limit, right? But the national government has, money that it will allocate to states for essentially road infrastructure if it follows this kind of speed limit. That's why when you go from state to state, the speed limits are generally very close to being the same. But Montana was like, we don't have a lot of roads. We don't need that money for infrastructure. We'd rather just drive as fast as we want during the day. We don't want, we want the freedom to drive as fast as we want. That has since changed, but again, how could Montana at that time get away with doing that? Because there's not as many people in Montana as there is in California. They don't have the roads, they don't have the damage to the roads to need money to repair it. And so they prefer to have that freedom. And so these are the kinds of ways in which the government can't really make you do things, but it can say, well, we won't give you this money if you don't follow this policy. And some states will take the money and some states won't. Depends on the issue. So hopefully you have some sense of history. I'm going to say there's these 5 kind of important historical events that are really important for this class. We're going to have the Civil War, which is going to be talked about right now, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and I'm missing one, the Great Depression. So you really want to be aware of those 5 events because they really impact how our governance has evolved and changed over time, right? But with regards to, say, federalism and the Civil War, we have this quote from page 82. The defeat of the South had a huge impact on the balance of power between states and the national government in 2 ways. First, the Union victory put an end to the right of states to secede and to challenge the legitimate national laws, right? So even then, prior to the Civil War, we call the antebellum kind of America, right? The antebellum South, is states really much still thought of themselves as countries. And so like when you look at the history and how Robert E. Lee, who was like the head of like the Virginia Confederate military, like, he was actually offered the generalship of the Union. He said, no, I have to defend my country. So even then, they were still thinking of the states as their countries, right? Second, Congress imposed several conditions for the readmitting former Confederate states into the Union, among them the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, right? So the 15th Amendment is really, really important. I mean, they're both important, but this allowed African-American men to vote. It wasn't until later till women. The 19th Amendment could vote. But the 14th Amendment basically says that all American citizens in all states have to be treated equally. So after the Civil War, after this kind of bloody feud where more Americans than any other conflict had died, even though the states were now kind of subject to federal authority, this kind of dual federalism developed, which is the states didn't really want to have much to do with the federal government. Again, this very much had to do with the southern states kind of losing this war, being very upset about that. And this is important, and we'll talk about these things particularly in, say, Chapter 5 with regards to civil rights. This dual federalism where the states did their one thing and the national government did their other thing, this is what allowed segregation to take hold. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, you get all these kind of great civil rights achievements, ending slavery, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. The Republican Party is this huge progressive party at the time and makes all these amazing things. You get black Americans elected into the Congress. But then because the states were interpreted the 14th Amendment as separate but equal, then these things like Jim Crow laws and this kind of subjugation and oppression of the African American community and other minorities was allowed to take place because it's like, well, it's our state's right to do these things this way, And I know we have this kind of talk right now about how great democracy is, but you have to remember that all these terrible things were instituted through democracy, right? So African Americans were then and are now still a minority. So even if, whites had let them vote, they may have changed some outcomes, but they were still going to have this kind of oppression faced because there was no national authority to tell these states to overturn their democratically voted policies and things like that. That often very much gets overlooked when we talk about these things because I think our society is very much focused on the popular vote right now. Then later on we get this idea of cooperative federalism. So both levels of government coordinate their actions to solve national problems like the Great Depression. I should have a video now that I'll post that you can watch from a movie. The New Deal changed. This is like this policy to get Americans back to work, changed the relationship Americans had with national government. Before the Great Depression, the government offered little in terms of financial aid, social benefits, economic rights, and the New Deal, it also had old age pension, Social Security, we still have that, unemployment insurance, so on and so forth. And so this is a big deal because no state and the federal government itself could not solve the problem of the Great Depression. They kind of had to work together to overcome all these kinds of like mass unemployment, people starving, in order to have actual governmental action. And so we're left with this legacy because many of us just expect the government to solve problems. Whereas prior to the Great Depression, Americans very much did not expect the government to solve their problems. So we've become less and less independent over time. And this, again, is kind of these battles that Democrats and Republicans have today. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular, we get this kind of new federalism. So again, Republican administrations, right? So this was the New Deal was very much, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, much more comfortable with like government solving problems, whereas Republicans generally tend to be much more dubious of government solving problems because it takes away freedom. And so Nixon and Ronald Reagan kind of instituted this new federalism where the premise is the idea of decentralized policies enhance administrative efficiencies, reduces overall public spending, and improves policy outcomes. So again, this might not seem relevant to us, but now because of all this COVID stuff, especially if you're a parent and have kids going to school, this idea of school choice where the government's going to give you essentially a stipend or your allotment of tax money to send your kids to whatever school they want, whether it's the school across the street in a better neighborhood, Beverly Hills, or partially helping fund a private school. That's kind of an example of new federalism that we're going to be probably arguing about when these debates happen in a couple of weeks. Getting to Section 3, again, talking about grants and mandates. I won't go too much into that. We talked about the grants already. It's basically money for different policies to follow. But there's also mandates, where it's like, or it could be penalties. And I'll leave it to you to kind of, work through that and know the difference. But it's definitely key terms you're going to want to know. Then we get this idea towards the end about, competitive federalism. And so it's this idea that, there's 50 states doing 50 different things. It's supposed to kind of be like an experiment. So we have here on certain issues not clear what the role of the federal states are. And they change concerning, so again, the example of the current corona response. And so, you can see what Nevada's doing, go, oh, that's working, that's not doing. Oh, Texas did it a different way. So we all know these different states that have different things, and so, we can learn from their mistakes. We know New York had a big mess, and so all the different states learned from their mistakes because no one could tell New York or the New York government what to do. And so that's kind of one of the advantages. One of the problems is, again, with federalism, like with segregation, like with coronavirus, is that different states are going to do different things, and not everyone's going to be a fan of those policies. So pretty much any political issue that's a controversy in the United States, whether it's abortion, whether it's immigration, if you pick your issue, it becomes more contentious because of federalism, because each state's going to handle those things differently from the federal government, drug laws, things like that. So what are some of the advantages of this? The book talks about this, and again, the book could be biased to an extent. It's not unfair, but we have this problem that the political system is unwieldy when addressing failures of justice on social issues, which is fair. So again, you see that with, like, say, abortion issues. Some states, if they're for women's rights, are going to be much more accommodating for those types of, like, say, clinics and funding, where other states aren't. But you would still think, even if the state's a red state, there's going to be people who are more left-leaning who want access to those types of things. The book talks about race to the bottom, where a state might cut policies in order to kind of cut down its spending, and so then you kind of end up with these social justice issues, which is true. No social safety net for say food stamps or things of that nature. But see, the thing it misses, which I don't think is fair, is the benefit I have here is it also accommodates diversity of opinions. So we talked about that. But in terms of economics, like say Texas and Florida don't have state income tax. And so whenever you especially look at like athletes like say LeBron, like where do you think he puts his address? It's not LA, right? LeBron James' address is in Florida. Why? Because he gets to keep more of his money. If you follow Joe Rogan, the podcaster, like he's moving to Texas. Why? Because he just got all this money and he doesn't have to pay taxes on it. And so one of the advantages of that is that you take business and then you get more money in tax revenue, not because the taxes are higher, but because there's more businesses there that are paying that lower rate. I think even Elon Musk said he's going to move a Tesla company to Texas to avoid California's taxes. So one idea is, again, it's a kind of race to the bottom, but it could also be the case, again, if you're more a right-leaning person, that it's improving economics so that everyone benefits. So it's kind of both at the same time, which is a theme of this class. The good things and the bad things kind of happen together. So again, I've run through this. I don't know how long this video is, but hopefully you're finding these things useful and making sense. I'm not mumbling too much. Take the things you're not understanding from these lectures and again, ask me the questions in class. But hopefully this discussion's helpful, and I'll be making these things in the next couple weeks and posting them. So hopefully they're making sense. But I'll see you guys in class and in the next video.